30 FPS target on consoles did lead to some upset players. The game's massive scope arguably justified that 30 FPS refresh, with only high-end PCs capable of hitting 60 FPS and higher frame rates. After some
Ήτανε πολύ βαρύ.
considerable optimization though, Bethesda has opened the floodgates on Series X consoles, allowing players to select from performance and visuals modes.
Εντάξει, η διαφορά δεν είναι και τόσο μεγάλη. Δηλαδή στέκεται και στα 60. Μπορεί να έχει φάει λίγο hit στο performance, αλλά στέκεται.
Along with a litany of target frame rates. So exactly how well do these new modes fare? Is 60 FPS really a possibility?
Τι έδειξε εδώ?
Is 60 FPS Exactly how well do these new modes fare? Is 60 FPS really a possibility?
Τσίπησες με 100 ευρώ μεταχειρισμένο. Τι λέει, φοβερή τιμή. Δεν γίνεται χειρή. Φοβερό, καλύτερα δεν γίνεται.
Players with a pretty dazzling array of options at first glance. We have two key modes, visuals and performance, along with display targets for 30 FPS, 40 FPS, 60 FPS.
60 Hz λέει, έχεις... Και VRR.
And uncapped frame rates, with different availability depending on your display type and system settings. Plus, there's an on-off toggle for VSync to enable the possibility of tearing if you prefer. Let's start with untangling the visuals and performance modes. There's an obvious difference in terrain rendering between these two versions.
Αυτές τις διαφορές στα renders δεν θα την καταλάβεις εύκολα παίζοντας όπως παίζει ο περισσότερος κόσμος. Ειδικά με τις τηλεοράσεις. Είναι πάρα πολύ δύσκολο να σε ενοχλήσει.
These two versions. Starfield uses a procedural terrain system, and the settings here appear to differ somewhat. There's not necessarily a clear quality divide between the two here, though. They just have differently sculpted and shaped terrain details. We actually saw the same split here between Series S and Series X at launch. There is,
Το Series S, παιδιά, δεν πήρε 60 FPS, Καλά, έτσι δεν είναι.
however, a consistent difference in ground clutter favoring the visuals mode. There's a greater volume of shrubs, small rocks, grass, and other little incidental details in the visuals mode, especially at a distance. It doesn't have a huge impact on the presentation, but it's definitely noticeable in my testing. I also noticed that some distant objects use lower LODs in the performance mode at a distance. And some texture MIPs are higher resolution in the visuals mode. Probably the most significant difference here, though, lies in the resolution of the game's cube maps. Starfield makes use of frequently updated cube maps for reflections, and detail and clarity are much higher in the visuals mode. We can simply make out much more detail than in performance mode. At point-blank range on a flat reflective surface, neither gives an especially convincing result, but on undulating water or
Στο S δεν έχει δώσει 60 FPS, όχι. Νομίζω δεν έχει δώσει. Πείτε μου αν κάνω λάθος. Από ό,τι ξέρω έχει δώσει μόνο στο X 60 FPS. Σιγά μην δεν είναι στο S 60 FPS.
metals, both modes
Αλλά από αυτό που βλέπω εδώ πέρα η διαφορά, δηλαδή οι απώλειες που έχει φάει για να φτάσει τα 60 FPS είναι πολύ μικρές. Δηλαδή δεν έγινε κάτι φοβερό. Καταλάβατε. Δηλαδή, καλοδεχούμενο, ας πούμε. Δεν είναι όπως παίζω το Warhammer Dark Tide. Ξέρω πώς έχετε παίξει στο Xbox. Καμιά σχέση. Το 60 με το 30 είναι μέρα με τη νύχτα. Το έχουν καταχειρουργήσει το παιχνίδι.
Deliver passable looking reflections. Other basic visual settings appear to be matched between the two modes, or close to matched. Shadows are the same in my testing, for instance, with very similar detail and draw in. It's hard to get an exact match because of Starfield's constantly shifting time of day, but there's no visible difference to my eyes.
There's no visible difference to my eyes. Πολύ καλό optimization.
Starfield has crowd density selections available on PC, so I tried to evaluate crowd density across the two Series X modes. I didn't actually spot any real difference at all between the two settings, although obviously there's a lot of run-to-run variation here. I restarted my game between settings changes to ensure a correct result. Bethesda highlighted crowd density as one of the tweaks they made between the two modes, so I did expect to see a more substantial difference. Beyond any settings tweaks, Starfield reacts somewhat curiously when you actually change the game's visual settings. In some environments, especially on Mars, we see dramatic lighting changes when swapping between settings. Notice how bright and shiny everything is, with the lighting settling down over time. I believe the global illumination here is just taking some time to accumulate and display correctly when we swap out the settings. Indirect lighting can look incorrect or broken while this occurs because Starfield uses a real-time GI system, so the game can't just rely on GI bakes. The actual quality of the indirect lighting appears very similar between the two modes once everything has settled down. Resolution metrics do differ somewhat between the modes, perhaps unsurprisingly. The visuals mode comes in at a 1440p pixel count, while the performance mode clocks in at 900p.
900p, όχι ρε παιδιά. Αλήθεια.
And both
900p είναι.
appear to use VRS as well. I didn't spot any dynamic resolution in my testing, though Bethesda does mention it as a possibility, so it may be present in the game under load.
Τι μαλακία είναι αυτή, γιατί επιμένουν με τα 900p. Και στο προηγούμενο Xbox, το Xbox One, 900p ήταν το sweet spot.
But both visual modes appear just about equally sharp and detailed when you actually examine still shots, with both delivering a clear and 4K-like final image. I believe both modes are upscaling to 4K or close to 4K using FSR2 here. The game has plenty of
FSR3, πότε?
telltale FSR2 artifacts, including fizzle on particle effects, that suggest the technique. It is surprising that the performance mode is targeting such a high resolution though, as FSR2 becomes much more expensive at higher output targets. You would typically expect a lower final resolution for a 60 FPS targeting mode. The game's lower internal resolution in the performance mode does give the game a bit more of that characteristic instability at rest that we sometimes see with TAA-style techniques, though most of the time it's usually not much of a concern. We do occasionally find pockets of detail that don't resolve correctly with the 900p internal resolution, but it's not too common. In motion, it does become a bigger issue, with more obvious shimmer in the foliage here for instance, but I didn't find it distracting. All the testing thus far has been conducted at 60 Hz, with the visuals mode set to 30 FPS and the performance mode set to 60 FPS.
Εγώ δεν πιστεύω ότι κρατάει κάτω τις κονσόλες η AMD. Δεν το πιστεύω αυτό. Είναι μια οικονομική λύση, αλλά εγώ πιστεύω πως βγάλουν το FSR3 και μπει το AI στη μέση θα γίνουν οι κονσόλες πιο ισχυρές.
Yes, but I did test them with other frame rate and refresh rate settings, and the modes appear to be identical with those settings as well. So these findings should apply equally to all permutations of the visuals and performance modes. Starfield's performance with the new update is a little bit complicated. Let's start with the standout
Τα 900p έτσι. Οφέρει τα 900p.
visual option here. The performance mode targeting a 60 FPS output. I've set the console to 60 Hz to test out most of the visual options here, though we'll get to 120 Hz in a few minutes. The good news is that this mode is indeed capable of achieving 60 FPS in a range of content. Interior combat encounters generally run at a flat 60 FPS.
Στον εσωτερικό χώρο είναι πιο εύκολο να το φτάσεις αυτό.
Frame time deviations. Certain smaller scale environments, including the Mars and Neon cities, generally hit 60 FPS as well, though frame rate drops can occur occasionally. Planet exteriors also typically hit 60.
Είναι situational τα drops. Είναι situational τα drops.
It's not a perfect turnout so far, but the game is surprisingly close to hitting its full 60 FPS target. That comes with a big asterisk though.
Δεν φτάνουν τα 1080 γιατί χρειαζόμαστε κι άλλο tech, ρε φίλε. Εγώ δεν νομίζω. Εγώ πιστεύω ότι όταν βγει το FSR3 και το AI θα μπει μπροστά, θα είναι πιο εύκολο να τα φτάσεις. Θα είναι πιο εύκολο.
Gila and New Atlantis, the two most complex city environments in the game, run much more poorly than the rest of the game content. We're typically in the 30s and 40s here, with some larger repeatable hitches in certain areas. It's not ideal, of course, but in my testing, these were the only areas that consistently failed to reach a 60 FPS target. The other parts of the game fare much better. If we keep the frame rate target at 60 FPS, but change to the more ambitious visuals mode, the game actually manages to come surprisingly close to the performance mode. In these two larger cities, for instance, we're still in the 30s and 40s, which is evidence the game is substantially CPU limited in these environments.
Τα 40 και τα 50 και τα 35 frames χωρίς VRR είναι λίγο ταλαιπώρια. Άμα έχεις και VRR οθόνη που μπορεί να το τρέξει, είναι πολύ καλύτερα τα πράγματα.
In line with the performance of the PC code. Smaller scale interior environments can also hit and sustain 60 FPS. A pretty novel feat given that we are running the game with settings that are really intended for 30 FPS play. But larger interiors and planet-side environments exhibited more sustained performance losses that seem to stem from that much higher internal resolution, and often land in the 40s. These framerate dips are pretty distracting on a conventionally refreshed display, with the performance mode landing a pretty sizable lead in these gameplay spaces. Stepping down to 30 FPS, we achieve a pretty solid framerate lock in the visuals mode. Almost all content runs at a straight 30, which isn't a surprise considering the launch version of the game also managed to hit a solid 30 FPS. Any framerate perturbations are typically on the smaller side, with the game dropping a handful of frames from time to time when traversing more complex city environments. There are more substantial dips here as well on occasion.
Αυτό το λένε performance patch, ναι. Τώρα τι να σου πω. Ναι, από ό,τι φαίνεται οι εξωτερικοί χώροι υποφέρουν πάρα πολύ στο παιχνίδι, έτσι. Το FSR 3.1 είναι ήδη, ναι, είναι ήδη ρε φίλε, αλλά τι να σου πω. Εγώ πιστεύω θα το δούμε, εάν το δούμε σε αυτή τη γενιά θα κάνει μεγάλη διαφορά πάντως. Θα δείτε ότι άμα το δούμε σε αυτή τη γενιά θα κάνει πολύ μεγάλη διαφορά.
But it's otherwise smooth sailing. Likewise with the performance mode at 30 FPS. The general run of play here is identical to the visuals mode, with only Aquila and New Atlantis really posing a framerate concern. Again, to the extent we are seeing dips here, they seem to stem from spikes in CPU load. I'd say this option is a little bit pointless then, given the near identical performance level and superior graphics in the visuals mode at 30 FPS. If we step up to 120Hz output, a 40 FPS option becomes available.
Και frame generation, τα πάντα, ό,τι μπορούν να βάλουν. Ό,τι μπορούν να βάλουν.
Not just in terms of the frame rate target, but also in terms of the frequency of frame rate drops. Expect a more variable performance level in and around.
Η κλιμάκωση εικόνας είναι, από ό,τι θυμάμαι, scaler, πώς το λένε, upscale method είναι αυτό. Βάζεις μικρότερη για να φτάσει σε ένα συγκεκριμένο target που το έχεις ορίσει. Αν δεν κάνω λάθος. Διορθώστε με. Αλλά είναι κάποιο scaling είναι γι' αυτό.
Certain cities, with occasional performance problems out in the open world. The performance option here outperforms the visuals mode, but by a less obvious margin.
Άλλη είναι αυτό.
Out in the open world. The performance option here outperforms the visuals mode, but by a less obvious.
Το frame pacing είναι υποφέρει. Χρειάζεται κι άλλο patch πάνω από αυτό.
Margin than you'd expect. With both mostly hitting 40 FPS in typical play outside.
Άμα το βάλεις και βάλει DLSS πειράζει, δεν νομίζω να σε πει. Όχι, δεν θα σε πειράξει. Τι να σε πειράξει. Ό,τι σ' αρέσει στο μάτι ρε φίλε, βάλ' το να παίζει.
A lot of the game's frame time inconsistencies are ironed out.
Πολύ κακό frame time, πολύ κακό frame time έχει το παιχνίδι.
Especially when the Series X is set to 120Hz output. The key here is that Starfield's frame times are pretty reasonable, even when CPU limited, so a wobbly 35 or 45 FPS frame rate can feel quite consistent with VRR enabled. I can't show this to you directly on the current version of the game, but the first patch we were sampled completely disabled VSync.
Δεν καίγονται ρε παιδιά κάρτες με αυτά τα πράγματα.
When aiming for 60 FPS. You can see how flat that frame timeline is, excepting some more significant momentary hitches at times. The current version of Starfield on Series X runs with VSync at all times by default, and the VSync toggle that is available simply allows the game to tear in the very top portion of the screen, with a minimal effect on frame times. Finally, we can run the game with no framerate cap, though this option is only available to us when we are running the game at 120Hz output with VRR enabled.
Performance uncapped. Έχει uncapped mode.
In smaller scale environments, 90 to 100 FPS seems achievable in the performance mode, with more moderate framerate gains elsewhere, and the same dips as we find without VRR, of course. In the visuals mode, the performance uplift when available is more moderate, and a large portion of the experience is still sub 60. Personally, I'd probably gravitate towards having a framerate cap over leaving the game uncapped, even on a VRR display. If only because Starfield's significant frame time spikes are less intrusive with a lower typical frame rate. Playing the performance mode at 60 FPS with VRR output feels like a good sweet spot to me that provides the most consistent and most smooth overall experience. Though I could see an argument for most of the other visual options available here. I think the latest Starfield patch is largely successful. The game performs at a high enough level at this point to work with a wide range of framerate targets, and the configuration of the two actual modes here is pretty sensible. VRR is helpful for sure, though a lot of content works well enough without it. Ultimately, expectations do need to be in check as Starfield.
Πάντως στο VRR, όσες φορές έχω ασχοληθεί με το VRR, σε οθόνη που είχα και δούλευε, κάνει διαφορά. Στο κάνει το παιχνίδι πολύ πιο smooth. Ήταν χρήσιμο. Αν μ' άρεσε το Starfield, μ' άρεσε τόσο ώστε να ασχοληθώ. Το ξανακατέβασα τώρα που έχει βάλει το update για να παίξω πάλι. Δεν το θεωρώ ότι ήταν πολύ κακό. Μέτριο προς καλό αυτό.
Is a pretty demanding game for mid-range and lower-end CPUs. But as long as you understand a locked 60 is off the table, you can get a good experience with higher framerate targets. Bethesda's visual choices on Series X consoles at least are fairly sensible and aren't overly confusing. The performance mode at 30 FPS does seem pretty much pointless, however, and it would be reasonable to block that combination.
Δεν το χρειάζεται το 30 FPS performance, μαλάκια μου.
My only real disappointment is that the Series S doesn't get any of the new visual options. I think that console plays perfectly fine at 30 FPS, but similar visual options really ought to be made available on Microsoft's junior current-gen console.
Έχει δίκιο.
There's room to degrade image quality in my opinion without ruining the game.
Θα μπορούσες να βοηθήσεις, βέβαια. Απλά δεν ασχοληθήκανε με το Series S.
So overall, Starfield's high frame rate console debut is successful. We can't quite get a locked 60 FPS, but we do get a healthy range of visual options to enable smoother Starfield experiences. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon.